Very quick question. How would you like to take POIs?
Hi, can you hear me? Hello. Can I confirm if you can hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Awesome. So yeah, I'll take POIs in the chat. Feel free to ping me there. I would most likely accept one from CEO or based on if it's a clarification or you just want to ask a POI. One second. All right. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want you to know clearly that this system of conglomeration for such high-end technology needed for research purposes is still conglomerated on upside either way, because in status quo, they are very expensive to access, which means very, very few rich research firms, high-end research firms are able to afford, for instance, the mega supercomputers that are needed for mass data analysis on the genome project, for instance, or the high-end supercomputers that are needed to do a lot of very specific and cutting-edge technological analysis. What this means is that on their side, the only thing that happens is that people who are doing these research now have to take their data samples to these private organizations who have these research materials and do it on their side for charges, which is a system that exists in most areas. So for instance, you're a research worker, you do not have access to that technology, therefore you carry your data set, go to a big company that has it, pay some amount, and then be able to analyze your data with them, carry your results, go back to your lab, and then work with it. The comparative on our side is then, instead of leaving it as a private market that exists, where people are able to profit off the scarcity, thereby creating an extreme cost barrier to research and its efficiency, we are able to consolidate it on a state level and then be able to gradually access it or allow people to access it in much more accessible and less costly ways. So I'm going to explain why this is likely to be the case. Two caveats within the speech. First of all, private research can still be done on our side. The only thing that you need is simply to go and use the data centers that exist. Similar to the model, like I said, private research is still done, even if people do not have access to those specific high-end cutting-edge technologies in their own labs, they simply go and pay at other private firms that do so. But secondly, if UP is likely to say, state is going to clamp down on research that they do not agree with. Look, if states don't agree with research, they would clamp down on it regardless of this policy. Why? Because a lot of research firms still need certification from the state. They sometimes need vetting for publication and approval of their results to endorse its validity. They need testing approvals, etc. For instance, if it's about drugs, food, blah, 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 you need to submit it to the state to give you approval, which means regardless of whether or not this policy exists, if states want to clamp down on your research, they're likely to do so either ways, unless their characterization is research that doesn't need state approval, which is most likely legal research. Therefore, this characterization doesn't fly. So any up counterfactual that says, this reduces the ability of private research to exist, it exists either way. This is not a motion that creates a tipping point. Let's talk about the framing then. On our side, states are able to monopolize these research materials and are able to do this in specific ways. So for instance, this consolidation comes with maybe taking research funds that is allocated across all sectors like agri, health, finance, etc., and then combining it to be able to purchase these materials and keep it at the state center. It would mean maybe for feasibility purposes, in terms of increasing capacity, the state can spread like maybe one region, one center, sort of, to make it accessible so that not everybody has to go to one capital, huge travel times, etc., to be able to access these things. Even if they have to, data transfer and data analysis these days can be done virtually. Therefore, this can be still very accessible for people. The state has the financial capacity and the budget to do so, but also the state doesn't do this in terms of a profit engineering system. Therefore, the cost of accessing these research materials, like a supercomputer that you need to analyze your large data set, will still be very, very minimal. Even if the state is charging anything, it would only be for maintenance purposes. Therefore, the cost is far lower than on the private sector that exists on their comparative, where they are using this as profit-making mechanisms. Therefore, they charge higher premiums on it, but also because private entities are paying tax, therefore they have an active incentive to charge higher premiums in order to cover for their taxation mechanisms. I'm simply going to prove one thing in this PM speech, why the quality of research significantly increases on our side and why this is important. Let me first weigh this. Research is important for three structural reasons. A, because state policies are dependent on research. States use research findings and the kind of publications that come to be able to justify the kind of policies that they make to determine what is the best course of action, for instance, for climate change, to try and cure poverty and all of that, which means if you're able to improve quality of research, it goes a long way to actually affect the kind of pragmatic policies that states use to affect changes on people's lives. Secondly, because the decisions to sometimes refine or even pass new laws in themselves, which bind generations to come, are dependent on research findings, which means anything that actually improves the quality of the research actually secures a lot of these perpetual changes for the people. But thirdly, a lot of private organizations, specifically NGOs, rely on data to be able to prioritize, for instance, what is the most effective way of using the kind of funding and support that they get, or the kind of resources and investments that they get, which means that this also goes a long way in terms of prioritization of minorities and the kind of research and the kind of results and responses that they get. How then is research quality increased? First, let's talk about the way in which reduction of cost significantly improves this. Because once you reduce the cost, like I said, there are a couple of things that happen. A, people can then analyze more data sets, for instance, because researchers always have to make a compromise when it's expensive to analyze data sets. And so, for instance, if they comparatively have to analyze 5 on a standard, but then they do not have a lot of money, they'll probably say, okay, analyzing 3 is also fine. And so they'll choose to analyze 3, which reduces, for instance, the variance, the quality of output that they're likely to get, or the diversification of that result in very, very meaningful and distinct ways. What it means is that you're reducing the quality of the output because we are not now having a much more holistic view of those data sets of those outcomes within the vast majority of instances. Before I move on, closing up.
Yeah, can you explain what policy outcomes are supported by state acquisition of a particle accelerator or a mass spectrometer?
Yeah, I don't think I need to do that. You can spend your 14 minutes proving that. I just need to prove why this is beneficial for the research community within the state. Secondly, why this is helpful is because it improves much more independent research, because a lot of researchers are unable to access research and do it even though they are passionate about it because of high cost barriers, not specifically for the small things, because a lot of, for instance, university lecturers still have access to the small things within their universities anyway. Usually the structural barrier is the very high-end cutting-edge technology that they do not have access to and have to pay huge sums of money for it. Once the state is able to reduce its costs by consolidation, you are able to create much more independent research and make it much more feasible to run this. What this does is increases the diversity of research pool that exists, which means that there's much more research for different sectors of things to be able to consider from different perspectives that directly increase the holistic nature of data that you have to make concrete decisions, because now you have much more perspectives on the table to be able to view. But thirdly, you have increased rate and the pace at which research can be conducted, because now it is not, you don't have to always wait for funding, or you don't have to spend decades fighting for research grants, etc., that are very, very expensive. Sometimes you have to do 3 or 4 grants because it's so expensive to access the kind of tools that you need. On our side, this is able to help. But fourthly, the kind of multiplicity of research and the availability of it that comes. And a lot of the time, note, when state makes it very easy for you to access research materials and grant you the ability to do your research, there's some level of requirement for you to put it out there as public resource, because there's a responsibility on the state to be able to do this. What this does is to increase the quality of research in ways that we've proven on opening government.
I'd like to thank Speaker very much for a speech, and I'd like to invite the first speaker for the opposition.
Hi, sorry, just 1 second. If you're asking POIs, it would be better if you just use the raise hand option on Zoom or switched on your video. I will try to look at the chat, but I can't really guarantee that I'll be looking at it. Am I perfectly audible to everyone? Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Here's the problem with the proposition. First of all, they don't understand what research looks like. Second of all, they don't understand what research equipment looks like. And third of all, they don't understand what nationalization of this equipment would look like. Let's explain what actually the research equipment falls underneath the criteria of this motion, and then we'll get to rebuttals. First of all, the biggest field that will be impacted by this motion is healthcare. Notice that data in neuroscience and biology is collected by machines like MRI machines that go upwards of $5 million per machine. More importantly, however, a nuance that they fail to include in their analysis is the fact that all of these machines require one, specialized faculty and facility members that have to maintain this equipment, and two, maintenance costs that can run in millions of dollars every single year just to upkeep the machines without any research being done in them or any use of them whatsoever. Secondly, there are fields like biology where you have CRISPR and gene editing, genome sequencing, which are things that are incredibly expensive and incredibly time consuming, which necessarily means that any state-owned enterprise out of these kind of things is doomed for failure, because you can't have scheduling conflicts when you don't know how long a single job or a single run of that equipment is going to take. Secondly, let's talk about computing, right? Because they say that clusters can be accessed from anywhere in the world. That's not really how clusters actually work. Clusters are used in almost every field, and these high performance computers are required to do machine learning and AI. They're ubiquitous in statistical analysis, but here's the problem. They're ridiculously expensive. They're ridiculously hard to maintain, and cluster protocols for every different research group completely vary by group, by research interest. This necessarily means that different groups and different universities, different people are fundamentally incompatible, which means that you cannot have a nationalized grid of supercomputers doing everybody's research. It sounds ideal, but it's not a practical reality, and that's what they had to defend in this world. Finally, then, in terms of natural sciences and what the nature of this equipment is, right? Notice that, as CO even brought up, at the point at which you have particle accelerators, laser meshes, these are extremely cost inhibitive for government, which is paid by taxpayer money to be able to develop and maintain on a long period of time. Furthermore, this disincentivizes private research within the private funding within this field, and I'll explain that more. But the key factors to take away from all of this analysis is that there's heavy upfront cost, there's heavy maintenance cost, and these are geographically restricted. Moving on to some rebuttals and the shallow analysis we get from OG, right? First of all, they say that most of the motion is symmetric because state-owned facilities anyways exist, as these equipment are cost prohibitive. This is exactly untrue within the actual reality. Because these things are cost inhibitive, governments typically do not spend money on buying these kind of equipment and leave it to the private sphere, because they're able to make profit off of these and recompense the cost of millions of dollars used in this research equipment, which might not necessarily help state policy that much, because they couldn't explain to us how state policy actually is used by this research, which necessarily means that the government has no incentive to fund research that might be prohibitively expensive but has future gains, because governments are short-termist. Second, then, in terms of how private research is no longer truly private in their world, because necessarily if you don't own the equipment and you don't own when you can use the equipment and how you can use the equipment, that's not your equipment, that's not your research, you're no longer a private institution. Finally, then, on the clampdown on research, right? They say that if governments had to clamp down on research for ideological reasons, they would have done this anyways. The problem is that while the protocols are still the same on either side, you're most necessarily not having the same amounts of resource allocation. This necessarily means that you can't have private institutions that are funded for one thing and one thing specifically, because now when the government is allocating resources and decide that I'm going to spend these many computers on this field and these many computers on this field, and these are the ways that we jerry-rig the metrics, this is necessarily going to be some loss of strategy, some loss of actual focused research within particular fields that private entities have a vested interest in solving. Because of the lack of vested interest, because of the lack of resource allocation in the optimal way possible to solve problems, governments are designed to fail at the task of research allocation. And finally, on this little point of how they analyze more data sets and data will be free and all of that, even if private equipment is free, you're necessarily not going to have the data being shared between researchers, because at the end of the day, we're doing work. This is a completely ridiculous argument. You can't have just data sets being shared for free. That's not how research works. This is not comparative at all within this debate. I'll take a POI. I'll take your POI.
Yeah, your claim cannot be that that's how it works in status quo. So let's stick to it. But also the motion says assuming feasibility. So it cannot be that it's impractical.
Assuming feasibility means assuming economic feasibility. It does not, however, mean that you will just everything will work within your world. If everything was to work in your world, then necessarily there's no need to debate this motion. the kind of problems that we're talking about within this world are about how that resource allocation exists and why, even if it's feasible, it'll be far, far worse on your side. That's the debate, that's the comparative. The first argument then on how this will impact university level research, because we think that they are the major stakeholders, college professors, postdocs, graduate students, and undergraduate students. One, the geographical distribution of these resources constrains the optimal research use. When equipment is centrally distributed and not distributed in colleges where the majority of researchers are, it makes it difficult to access these resources. Why do we say that the distribution is unlikely to be around colleges? Because the distribution is based on state-sponsored metrics, which implies resource sharing. Because the government does not have, one, enough money to sponsor all research groups, but two, the government involves disincentivizing private research funding, because private research organizations don't like when governments exert ideological control over the research that's being generated, and governments don't, and private institutions don't like government inefficiency because it gets in the way of any return of investment. Because of this, if you don't have private research funding, then you necessarily don't have enough resources, and that way you have resource sharing. Resource sharing means bad geographical allocation of these resources, and as we already mentioned, these resources cannot be moved around. They're like fixed stable assets. This necessarily means that you compromise the quality and quantity of research, as contrary to what they say, researchers will have to move around and keep lugging their subjects and lab equipment that they need everywhere, because they have to go to those centers to get access to that equipment. A second contention then, and this is crucially the most important one here, the nature of research changes in the comparative. And I already talked about this, but at the point at which the government has control over research allocation, it prevents the development of highly focused research institutions that can achieve their goals. Secondly, research is likely to fail on their side due to government inefficiency, due to reduction of funds for research from privatization, because there's no specialization of lab managers, research community, and other facilities that are actually required and vary from research group to research group. And this is like implementing a top-down policy on every single research group in the world. That's necessarily not going to happen. And more importantly, you can't have any independent research as they claim, because you can still have public structures on our side, but at the point at which nationalization means every research equipment has to be a part of the state, this has constraints and inefficiencies. So proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the speaker very much for this speech, and I would like to invite the second speaker for the government.
All right, can you see and hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, just a second. Set up my timer.
Yeah, I'll send timestamps for you.
Okay, let me go outside. All right. POIs within the chat space, most likely within the 5th minute. If I've still not taken you by 5, then you can use voice, but only after 5. We have a simple claim on our side of the house that research is going to be far more accessible and will be far more effective. I want to begin by, first of all, defending our case, because on the side of opposition, they do claim that the counterfactual is likely to exist. What they do is to fiat that private investment most likely would exist to be able to create these resources, because governments in themselves do not have the funds and resources to be able to execute this. Note that this is not true for a lot of reasons. First of all, private incentives, which would be to gain profits, can also be dissuaded by all of the conditions which they mentioned, like the maintenance cost, like the ability to make profits. The fact that, yeah, in some instances, you won't have the capacity to be able to put up this scale, or that private functions in themselves will not be able to raise this money, especially for most developing countries. This would not exist, and therefore they have just no capacity to be able to enjoy the counterfactual as it exists on their side of the house. There's no analysis on how it would work to be able to append all of the difficulties which they themselves point out over here. Secondly, on the money to start this up in the first place. We've showed you from our modeling that the level of cross-functionality gives us the ability to be able to leverage on the economies of scale to be able to even start this in the first place. Because in the counterfactual, governments will still need to support and fund research. What is going to make this even way more difficult is that government now has to pick and choose between competing research because it needs to give money individually to all researchers to be able to do these things in the first place. We think we gain a lot of advantages when we do this on a scale and allow people to be able to access these equipment and take away the very high cost of equipment which means we can fund way more research on our side of the house instead of picking and choosing in a way also that it is way more scalable. On ideological restrictions, we already told you, to a certain degree, governments still have the ability to be able to clamp down on this, and this is not taken away to a huge degree. Private incentives can still exist to be able to fund this research. Where we think the distinction comes in is in just being able to use the equipment in this instance. Lastly, they said there's bad geographical allocation, that this will be put somewhere and people need to move. That also doesn't take into cognizance what the counterfactual exists like. In most nations, these equipments don't exist. Like for my research, we had to travel to Kenya to be able to do just some simple primer analysis just because the equipment did not exist within Ghana. I think on the comparative, the geographical distances are way huge, given that private incentives are more likely going to situate these equipments towards far richer nations who most likely would be able to invest in this kind of equipment. We think the way in which governments do this will be far more collaborative due to the democratic functions which exist within them to ensure that these are places where it is far more utilized for most amounts of people. I'll take a POI from CEO if you have. Cool. Why do you get cheaper equipment on that side of the house in the first place? Or why do you have more access than this in a comparative? I already showed you from my responses that the initial investment on their side of the house may not exist even in the first place. Recognize also that certain kinds of research will most likely not exist in the first place due to the limitation in the equipment that is being used. Why is this so? Most often, this research seeks to use models which go around the use of this equipment in order to be able to reduce cost to a huge degree, or to avoid that research at all. And this then means that we are losing on a massive amount of benefits which are likely going to come from this research, which will fuel our education, health, and other sectors. Secondly, we have reduced costs as a result of the economies of scale. One, the related functions, which means we have the ability to combine different elements of biology and chemistry where we realize that they are similar. How does this help reduce the cost? It means most likely the equipment we go for have a level of multifunctionality optimization compared to single use as it exists in status quo. So you have chemistry building the same particle colliders, and then physics also building the same particle colliders, but optimized towards more of their research. On our side of the house, you have more push for multi-functionality optimization. Of course, it's not to the degree where it takes away your capacity to be able to do research on the other side, but only that the incentive on the counterfactual to be able to make these kind of accommodations does not exist at all. Secondly, there's reduced cost when it comes to land use and administrative cost and maintenance, in the sense that the same land which you now have when you build these super colliders can be able to host a variety of equipment instead of building them in different places. The administrative and maintenance cost is reduced to a huge degree, and the labor cost is also reduced to a huge degree because these are the same people who are equipped and specialized to be able to take care of all these equipment across a number of skills, which means that you do not spend that amount of money. This means that we are able to make this accessible and affordable for the most people. But lastly, there's increased demand on our side. Why? Because on their side of the house, when this equipment is built, when these equipment are built, the margins of productivity are way lower because you have less and less people who are able to use these things, given that it's single optimized, given that they exist within certain geographical locations. On our side of the house, because you have more people using this, the benefits you're able to get out of the more research means you can spread the cost around to be able to take care of these things. Last chance to MCO. Cool. Why is this important? This is to, first of all, create the research in the first place, which means on their side of the house, you have no research which exists as a basis of the limitation in the cost of the equipment. But secondly, the reduced cost also encourages more research on our side of the house. But thirdly, the money which we save from this is divested in other ways to be able to support different things which are required for our faculty. The way in which all of these things are decided, because I think one of the things they try to say is, why would the government invest in this particular kind of place? Because obviously, before these things are built, the way in which the government setup is, as I've described, is democratic, would ensure that there is far more maximum use of this, but then also accountability to the taxpayers to ensure that this is also used in the right scale and in the right manner, which means that it is targeted towards most parts of the economy, or most parts of the country, which is essentially requires that level of research. So on that side of the house, you are able to increase these things across board in a way in which they do not get on that side of the house. I think it is very important to note that on the comparative, life is not good for many of these scientists. Our ability to even provide this in the first place means that we're able to encourage more and more people to even be able to start these research and to be able to have the outcomes which are necessarily aligned in the manner in which they would want to do. I think you need to vote for our side of the house. Thank you.
I would like to thank Speaker very much for the speech, and also remind speakers for POIs. And without any further ado, I would like to welcome second speaker for the opposition.
Just to confirm, everyone can hear me clearly?
Yep.
Yes, and for POIs, I will check the chat, but just to do me a favor, if you can do the raise hand feature on Zoom, your image pops up, so it's easier for me to see that you have a POI. Okay, with that being said, I will get started in 3, 2, 1. So the first thing that OG tells us is that private investments under status quo do not have incentives. I think this is entirely true for 2 reasons. Number one, this is status quo. Majority of research currently does happen because of privately funded research grants, independent research institutions, and several individuals who are very rich and like to contribute their money towards researching to causes they feel passionately about. I think the mechanization here is simple. Why does private research get dissuaded on their side of the house? Ownership, Judge, means a lot in the sphere of research. Owning equipment, having the flexibility to do with that equipment what you wish, when you wish, and where you wish is a huge aspect. Research flexibility is a lot of the reason why independent organizations are incentivized to fund research. Privatization, however, is uniquely not compatible with the bureaucratic red tape that you get on their side of the house. Status quo is that private investments do happen into research because you have ownership of equipment and you have greater autonomy as to how that equipment is used. On their side of the house, however, you have government overreach, which necessarily is inefficient and stalls processes, which dissuades private actors from funding research. So no, you do not get private research on their side of the house. Under status quo, our side of the house, you do. So the claims that they make are entirely untrue. Then they tell you, well, it is good that the government gets to pick and choose between research projects. We tell you, however, that this is likely to be riskier. Why? Because the state can choose to accept and reject certain proposals. And insofar as they tell you that the state wants to fund research so that it can further its policy objectives, we tell you now that there's a perverse incentive for funding only certain types of research. I.e., if I'm a right-wing populist form of government, why would I want to fund research about climate change or abortion rights? These are topics that don't matter to me. These are topics that I don't really care about, so I will not be funding these sorts of research proposals. Insofar as the state has the ability to say yes or no to a particular research proposal, we tell you that this directly impacts and takes away the autonomy of independent researchers. Then they tell you, government clampdowns are good because we want higher quality research. I think this is a very non-unique point that you can just take out of the debate entirely. Why, Judge? Places where people publish their research, i.e. research institutions or journals, already have standards for publication. I can't just write a paper and submit it. I don't need the government to check my paper. Research institutions already have a rigorous application process. They have a rigorous peer review process. The research that I am putting out to the public, that I am publishing, is already being reviewed insofar as all of these institutions have set standards and have set regulations for publications. They aren't going to accept anything and everything. So when government tells you that, having the government look at research means that the research will be better and more accurate, is just fundamentally untrue. That's just not how research publication works in the first place. Then they try to beat back our geographical point, and we tell you that this is just untrue. The countries that they choose to focus on, i.e., poorer, undeveloped countries, unfortunately, they don't have research in the first place. So we shouldn't really be considering them in the round. We're talking about certain countries which are developed where billions are already spent on research. It's countries where research is already happening in status quo. And what government needs to advocate for is in these countries where research is already happening, change it from a largely privatized model with public structures to now a fully nationalized model. Then they tell you that we assume feasibility. Again, assuming feasibility does not mean that you have a government that's replete with every single type of machine that you require for research. Yes, the government may be able to afford some types of high cost equipment. Feasibility does not mean that they can afford every single type of high cost equipment. Why is this necessarily important? Because this reduces research flexibility. As my first speaker told you, all of these pieces of equipment cost millions and millions of dollars just to buy, not to mention the millions it costs to upkeep them. Obviously, governments do not have the funds to buy every single type of equipment that every single type of researcher is going to need. Yes, they might have the set few standards. Yes, they might have a few basic pieces of equipment, but there's no way that a government is able to afford the maintenance, the upkeep, and the overhead costs of the agency, plus buying all these pieces of equipment. So we tell you that on their side of the house, you simply have less equipment, which means less research can be done because a lot of these types of highly specialized research cannot be done without the equipment in the first place. Then they tell you we need to have more interdisciplinary study. Again, I ask you, why is the government particularly needed to do this? What government fails to prove is how the government is the delta to accessing all of these impacts. They're telling you things that already happen in status quo and acting as if, nationalized research is going to be the reason this already happens. But what they're instead doing is giving up non-unique impacts that happen in status quo. Plenty of interdisciplinary research happen in the status quo. You don't need the government to hold researchers' equipment hostage. Also, when they tell you that land and labor will become free, I don't think they understand how anything works, because land and labor is not even free for the government. These costs are not going to be reduced. They're just absorbed by taxpayers. So even if you're not paying a higher upfront cost to purchase the research equipment, you are paying by virtue of your taxes. And political incentives creates a very short-termist funding of research, and it's very problematic because constant regime changes are going to break the continuity of research. So you're going to have fewer longitudinal studies. These are factors the government fails to consider. Also, there are lobbying interests. For example, Christian groups that wouldn't want to have research in certain things. For example, there are certain religions that are against vaccine research. This meddles with independent research insofar as you have large lobbying groups that are pushing the government to say no to certain proposals. Then they give you all this ideology of research quality not being compromised. Now we tell you that if we are able to prove that research quality is better on our side of the house, we win, because this is the framework that OG gives you. Why is research quality going to be compromised on their side of the house? Number one, inefficiency. The process under government would take 3 times the amount of time because it is far too bureaucratic. This looks like research projects literally being stalled, waiting for a green light. This is very bad because research is often time sensitive. Then we tell you that there's going to be a lack of flexibility. Again, feasibility doesn't mean that the government is replete with every single piece of equipment that you need. So if you have a specialized type of research that has very expensive equipment that the government is unable to provide you, you literally have no way now to access that, because again, you've already disincentivized private actors from funding you. So now you literally have no avenues with which to access that research. Then we tell you that it compromises innovation. Why? Because governments judge are short-termist. If they do not see an end product to your research, if they cannot tie your research back to an incentive that they have, it's hard for them to justify allocation to that project. So therefore, if I cannot prove to you that my research is going to end in a cure for cancer, or my research is going to help figure out, why climate change happens, I'm not going to receive funding for that research, because governments need to show action, right? They need to show that, I funded this and look at what this research did. Therefore, they're not going to be incentivized to fund research that is in the works. They want cut and dry research that yields an end outcome. However, Judge, that's antithetical to how research works. Research is all about putting years into answering questions. It's not about producing an outcome, whereas governments are outcome dependent. Then I just want last thing, I want to turn their point about allowing smaller researchers to get started. I think it's far harder for that to happen on their side of the house, because obviously the government has to prioritize research, and we tell you that the government is going to prioritize super sensitive research, or a research that is like outcome dependent. This means that smaller projects are going to go by the wayside, because obviously the government cannot fund every single type of research. We tell you necessarily that this discourages researchers from starting out. So when they tell you they want to encourage minority researchers, disenfranchised researchers, this is not going to happen, because the government is never going to prioritize these projects. So for all of these reasons, the increase in efficiency, the lack of equipment, and the lack of the government actually saying yes to proposals and dissuading private research investment, we urge you to cast a ballot for OO. Thank you.
I would like to thank you very much for a speech. Again, I would like to remind speakers about POIs, and without any further ado, I'd like to welcome the third speaker for the government.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Let's chat. A tidal wave of research is on the way, and we think that that wave is going to be crucial to saving countless lives that have been unaddressed so far in this debate. The first thing we're going to tell you is why these agencies are likely to be well regulated. Note that in absence of this analysis, opening government is vulnerable to, at best, the characterization that corruption and other bad incentives will lead to the divvying out of these resources being terrible, or at best, the risk that the richest private companies and the richest universities will be able to overwhelm access to research, gutting off the access for smaller actors for them, and gutting the benefits that opening government gets. They are reliant on fixing this link in order for their analysis to work. Failure to do so is quite bad for them, and so we are going to patch this gap immediately. Firstly, know that private actors, different businesses, different companies will want to regulate the state because they don't want states to give advantages to their competitors. You don't want one company to be overwhelmingly having access to the really crucial research equipment. So that is why all of them work together and symmetrically put pressure on the state to not give asymmetric advantages to one over another. So the state is broadly going to be fair in how it provisions these things out. Secondly, the state provisions fairly because the state benefits from a competitive market. A competitive market means more investment from external competitors. It means more options for consumers to have cheaper goods and more jobs. Monopolies otherwise gut investments and lead to there's fewer opportunities. This is bad for the state and means that fewer people are willing to enter. So the state benefits from this, and so they're likely to provision these things fairly and do it in a just manner. Thirdly, many small firms can end up becoming a significant share of the market. Small firms in general tend to be 20 to 40% of the market, especially in important sectors like pharmaceuticals. So that means that this will end up being enough of a sector that can put pressure on the government to divvy it out in a fair manner. But lastly, if states can have independent central banks, I would think that they can do this too. They will staff it with the right people, don't micromanage them like civil services and reasonable markets do. They'll have competitions authorities being represented and have transparency requirements and making sure that they're doing this in fair ways that are likely to be criticized and applying the right pressure. The end conclusion of this is that this is what means that companies are going to be accessing this in a fair manner, and that states are likely to do this well, which is otherwise not something that we can take for granted in this debate. The second important thing I want to tell you is why we break the monopolies in crucial sectors like pharmaceuticals and are able to save crucial lives. I want to be fair to opening government. They do generically identify why cheaper research is good and do a pretty good job of explaining exactly how that would happen. But the problem here is that research can be made cheaper in a variety of ways. We can reduce overheads. We can give state and private grants. That doesn't justify the policy, especially where the policy brings some amount of substantial harm onto companies. But secondly, I think this is the bigger problem. They don't actually identify the root use for this research. Why is it so important, as closing opposition asks, for us to give access to things like mass spectrometers to everybody? There's a really important reason, which is breaking open the monopolies that things like pharmaceuticals hold. We will explain the core problem and how it is addressed. What is the problem? The problem is that there's a monopoly that is established by the possessors of equipment. This is stuff like the unique levels of graphic and neural network processing for AI firms, or more commonly, pharmaceutical research equipment that is massively expensive, patented, and developed by one company and blocked off so no one else can use it. This is magnetic resonance and mass spectroscopy that is used by companies like AstraZeneca to develop cancer drugs. This is ELISA kits and thermal cyclers for analyzing cell structures and breaking those open that's used to understand things like kidney diseases, where they have the unique access and don't give it to anyone else. This isn't just what OG point out, which is Oxford's nice equipment that they charge you to use. They block everyone from having this. This means that they set everybody else back by years so no one can compete. If mRNA vaccines can't be used by others, Pfizer can establish an effective monopoly where they can make better, cheaper vaccines than anybody else and charge whatever they want for unlimited profit. Why will companies hoard these technologies and not use them to do nice things? Firstly, because they lack the incentive. The less people access radiotherapy, the more people take chemo drugs. So they have a market incentive to freeze discoveries and entrench their good market provision, and so therefore they're able to cement themselves. Secondly, they lack capacity. They're usually tunnel visioned on single things, the discoveries that they want. They don't do things, for example, like chronic kidney disease discoveries and stuff like that, because that's not what they're used to and good at. But thirdly, they want to undercut competitors by cutting them off. You're risk averse. Your board is risk averse. You as a CEO have a fiduciary duty to do the maximally profiting thing, so you will gut your competitors and never give them an advantage. What this means is that in absence of this policy, there's unique equipment and data that is constrained just in the hands of a couple of companies. Why would this be so useful? Firstly, scale advantages. We can use this for different things. We can use the mRNA vaccine equipment technology or AstraZeneca's radiology equipment that we use for cancer stuff to also try and understand bone marrow transplants and save people's lives from immune diseases. Secondly, speed advantages. More companies being able to use this equipment in advantage pushes them to work harder and faster, so the discoveries that would save lives hit people faster and are cheaper on things like their insurance plans, or they're cheaper for the state, so more of them can roll them out through public health care. But thirdly, it's unique understandings that are just market reinventing. If one company has AI and others don't, they will be uncatchable. If one company has radiology that can micro-target and eliminate cancers, and nobody else does, then they will be uncatchable and they will be priced out of the market, giving one monopoly power. The harm here is twofold. Firstly, expense. This means people die when they cannot afford cancer treatment. It makes the drug more expensive because when you have unique equipment to develop, no one else can catch you, so you can charge whatever you want. But secondly, competitors cannot enter and cross-apply these different things. What changes on our side of the house? Firstly, these become far more competitive. They are cheaper because of the more competition, more actors being involved in the process, so that different ones compete and have to lower their costs to get their buyers, for example. There's more innovations because different people synthesize using the same equipment, so there's more people trying, meaning that one more person is more likely to make a crucial discovery. So these things get better, faster, and cheaper at reaching people. This is a more important problem to solve than opening government and at a wider scale. OG's problem on scale is not that big. If I want to work with a Cambridge researcher to collaborate on a project, we can get dispensation to use their supercomputers. So clearly this is not the most common or important use case. This is a more unsolvable problem with a broader scale effect where companies will not let you have that equipment at all and gut competition prima facie. Opening opposition, what do you say?
Why do you believe that the vast majority of the impact of this motion falls on private companies when over like 90% of research is conducted in universities?
Because either private companies can buy a lot of this stuff and then give unique access to university researchers, or they're the unique ones developing certain technologies, processes, and research. Secondly, we incentivize cooperation, especially between universities and companies, because it's easy to get access to collaborate with different companies. It's more efficient for both than to use it. Because on the comparative, otherwise you want the glory and the power for yourself, so you will not give that away. Now we synthesize better, get better applications, and more people saved. I can see that OG identifies this too, but the research that we get has broader effect. OG is excessively vague about what research does. They say it diversifies and synthesizes, but to what end? We tell you why it matters, why it's life-saving, and why it is useful. Finally, niche uses that are not otherwise done. Small-scale drugs like for rare birth defects and conditions like ALS or ME. AstraZeneca isn't trying to do those things because they don't think it'll have the mass profits of things like cancer. You need mass profits to offset the large cost of making, developing, or buying this equipment. And often we have companies who want to research and test out this stuff, but they don't have the ability to afford this equipment. This prices them out of even trying. Now we get this crucial drugs when otherwise no one develops them. It gives people a chance at a life where otherwise it doesn't. This means the impact reaches a more important set of people. The margin of benefit for somebody who would have their life saved or extended by 5 or 10 years by a drug that otherwise never would have been developed is far greater than more accurate statistics tracking. This is what is going to break it up the tidal wave of the most important research. That is why you should propose.
I would like to thank speaker very much for the speech, and I would like to invite the third speaker for the opposition.
Cool, just making sure everyone can hear me.
Yep.
Wonderful. I'll take POIs in the chat, thanks. 3 simple contributions from closing opposition. First, I'm going to explain why the process of accessing this equipment hampers research as compared explicitly to the status quo. That will deal with the set of harms brought by both opening government and closing government. Secondly, going to explain why there is less of this equipment produced because you make the government the only buyer for that particular type of equipment, destroying that market. And thirdly, going to explain why high-level research equipment needs to be accessible for civilian or otherwise non-research use in a way that it's not underside government. Let's firstly start with why the process of accessing this equipment under the status quo is good, because that will knock out both OG's claim on the justice of being able to access these types of research equipment, especially in other parts of the world, and it'll also knock out CG's bizarre claim that this is like the root of all corporate evil and the US pharmaceutical industry, which it absolutely is not. The first claim we'd make here is that the majority of cost of a research project is on things like staffing, is on things like intellectual property, and and that makes up an enormous amount of the cost of research and development, not on the licensing fee of the equipment. And it just just in case you don't believe me, because yes, this equipment is very expensive. Think about it. You need to use a mass spectrometer for a number of days, maybe, but you need to have really highly qualified PhD level staff to analyze the results of that mass spectrometer, spectrometer results for like weeks to months afterwards. Or you need to acquire the existing intellectual property or patent of a drug if you want to do a research project on it. So the types of projects that underside government would then be able to access this equipment in the first place have already ticked all of those boxes. They have already got all of their ducks in a row to be able to access that equipment. So there's not a huge degree of change there. The second thing we'd say is that a huge amount of this equipment is directly controlled by universities and other research institutions, even in the event where they are, for instance, appropriated by a research organization for, say, someone like AstraZeneca. And there are two things that are important about that. The first is that these universities and institutions have good processes like research boards to grant permission to projects based on need, where there is limited time available to use that equipment. And secondly, they have reasonable interest to help out under universities under the status quo, to do things like outreach to universities from other countries, or to, you know, for instance, waive some of those licensing fees for particularly needy projects. The third observation to make here is that there are many people who want to use these types of equipment, and a pretty clear market incentive to maximize your licensing fees by maximizing the amount of days of the year that that equipment is used. So it's really unclear why this leads to a massive increase in the efficiency of kind of days of the year that on which that equipment is used, and maximizing that output there. Compare that to the alternative of a government board. Closing government says, well, it can be good because central banks are good, which I'd suggest a lot of the time they're not. But let's take that at their best. Even a set of good incentives probably results, for instance, in intense US protectionism. It probably does result in, for instance, nationalism at that particular level, where you don't approve research that is being done overseas. For instance, lots of the best research in renewables is being, and that kind of like energy transfer is being done out of China. Why would a US research board ever allow, for patriotic reasons and for nationalistic or even national security reasons, that type of research to be conducted by their board in the United States? But the clowny reason that this closing government can't stand up is because they don't act perfectly. They want to talk about breaking up the pharmaceutical industry, which is notoriously an industry that has every member of US Congress in their back pocket. Like that is not the reason why drug companies are able to fleece the public. It is because of their intense degree of political lobbying, which just makes it infinitely easier, because now you don't need to capture every single university that might have a mass spectrometer or a genome sequencer. You just have to capture one government board, which they clearly have the capacity to do. The second thing in this speech is just to explain why there is less of this equipment produced. That's clearly the worst harm of this debate, no matter where you think it takes place, because that is the future genome sequences. That is the future supercomputers that we are losing out on. The first thing to say here is just that the equipment industry is very small in terms of the number of buyers, but it's quite competitive because you can sell those each component that goes into making that piece of equipment, for like the lasers, like the lenses, like any of that kind of stuff, for a very high price. The second observation is just that this makes it completely uncompetitive, because in any given jurisdiction there is only one buyer, which means that the government has an inordinate degree of purchasing power over that. To be clear, that is still a waste of money. We would still prefer that to be done by universities or by institutes, but it also means that the wholesalers and the producers of parts that go into equipment no longer have as much of an incentive to do the legwork and do the research and development to make better versions of that equipment in the future, or even to make this like new pieces of the same version of that equipment, because it is no longer profitable for them to do so at all. That doesn't have to do with the profitability of funding research. It literally is, do you build the MRI machine or not when a hospital breaks down? Do you break ground on a new particle accelerator when you know that the only instance in which you can sell that, the rights to that, is to the government, which has sole purchasing power over you? Let's thirdly then explain why high-level research equipment needs to be available for what I would call civilian use, because this government bench would concentrate it in their very best case between every single person who wants to do research, and there are some instances where patients, for instance, in hospitals matter more. But before then, I'll take a point from closing.
Opening.
Opening, yeah.
On both sides, richer companies still have competitive advantage in other areas beyond research equipment, therefore it is low impact. We bring the most relevant analysis in showing how more research is produced, which gives greater capacity to compete. But the interest
on
of the
either
US
side, there probably still isn't
sides.
the type of equipment that you need to use in a particular country, right? On either side, you do still need to pay the researchers that we described, and on either side, you do still have resource constraints. So that is also an issue that is symmetric. Let's thirdly explain why this equipment needs to be available for civilian use. The most important equipment in this debate is the equipment that is located in hospitals. It is MRI machines that are used in diagnosis and in research. It is genome sequences that are used in research and in the diagnosis of genetic diseases, or in the modification, for instance, of fetuses to make sure that they do not pass on Huntington's or diseases that are absolutely devastating to people's lives. The first question to ask here is, how does this equipment get used right now? It is in hospitals, usually university or research hospitals, because they have the money for it, but they get used both by that university or that research institution and by doctors in those hospitals who continue to treat patients and are often the only hospitals in those regions that have the sufficient capital in order to have that equipment there. They do tissue analysis both for research and for pathology. They cross-pollinate the use of that equipment in ways that are deeply impactful to people's lives. Secondly, how does this equipment get used on site government? Let's firstly account for the enormous approval delay. You cannot wheel a patient down the hall at the discretion of a doctor and use that MRI machine because you need to apply for a government permit. Even if that permitting body acts perfectly, that is still a delay that could mean that somebody's brain bleed doesn't get diagnosed. But secondly, the backlog that it results from the government's bench's best case, which is that we massively open the doors to anyone who wants to use that research, means that we would prefer that people wait longer in other parts of the country to do their research, or even other parts of the world. If it means that the person who drove 6 hours to get an MRI from the only hospital that can give it to them gets that MRI on the day that they need it to. This is not just about the types of research that uses mass spectrometry. This is about the people who desperately need diagnostic services. Incredibly proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank Speaker very much for her speech, and I would like to invite the last speaker for the government.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, give me 2 seconds. I'm just going to manage the papers. I'm going to first respond briefly to closing up. Secondly, then talk about how it is quite going to implement it well. Finally, on benefits of breaking up monopolies. On closing opposition, the first thing is extraneously is the idea that no one will want to be building those high-cost machines anymore. I would know that we will probably be able to flip that, right? Because even if those, like the specific high-cost machines are owned by the state, all the companies are still benefiting from the discoveries, right? They are still able to discover things, get patents on it, profit from that massively. It's just one step of that process. So all of those companies obviously have an incentive to force these machines to exist. So rather than like nothing being built anymore, it's actually encouraging cooperation, pooling together resources for more of them to be built, because now everyone is reliant on them existing, so they are able to rent them out. So at best this is symmetric, at worst this is symmetric, at best we actually get more of it. Thirdly, on the idea about like hospitals and stuff like that, the first, I would know that like some of those diagnostic machines are not the high cost, the ones that the motion really concerns itself with. But secondly, like this is about the state owning it, not like the state taking it and placing them all in the same room. So when it comes to things that you need for hospital for diagnosis, presumably these still exist and they can still be used at the in the same period of time. Let's then talk about the more important stuff in terms of in terms of the implementation. Opening opposition says that they are ridiculously hard to maintain and they are really expensive. The first thing I would note is that when it comes to the acquisition, presumably you just compensate the nationalized equipment for what you can afford. But then when it comes to the maintenance, obviously the assuming feasibility, I think the response works fair. Like there need to be some machines to exist. You can't get them rot in order to be able to rent them out. But even if you do not buy that, I want to refute the argument that opening opposition gives to that. Because they say, And OG just says like companies sometimes don't have the incentive to maintain it either. The whole argument is somewhat nuanced. They say that companies have vested interests, states don't have vested interests. So I want to respond to that, right? We pointed out, one, that those are concerning many essential sectors, right? Like pharmaceuticals, like AI. Those are things that are needed by people. Therefore, you have clear electoral incentives to be funding those machines because you're just not going to be sacrificing sectors by letting machines rot. But secondly, right, like the companies that are using it, it's also profiting from the discovery, still have lobbying power. They are still contributing tax revenue. They still, in many cases, like literally drive the economic growth when it comes to tech and stuff like that. So presumably, like the state is not going to sacrifice half of the state revenue because they're going to not maintain machines. So that like deals on the metric of opening opposition. The state obviously does have vested interest in funding and adequately maintaining that agency so that the machines are maintained adequately. Second thing they say is like, oh, like, you're gonna have less private investment into it now because like you can't guarantee that like it's gonna be used exactly for the purposes as you want. Again, right, private companies still get patents for discoveries, academics get published, all of those things like incentivize having the what's the word? Having investment into it, right? Like lots of those sectors are still profitable. The fact that these companies are able to get patents, it still generates profit for the investors. None of that really changes, just one step of the way. Then let's talk about why the agency is going to be functioning without biases. Opening opposition says the state will have perverse incentives to be picking and choosing. This might work against opening government because opening government doesn't really explain about why it's going to be used fairly. But there are several reasons why it's going to be used fairly. The first thing is that the word agency is in that motion for a reason. In any sensible democracy, agencies are not micromanaged by governments. Like you don't have a congressman like sitting there and approving the specific proposals. That is nonsense. They are populated by civil servants who obviously work across changing governments. They are not party dependent because that would be nonsensical and logistically really problematic for any country to work. So just like central banks, but just like any other independent agencies, those are things that are not government micromanaged. They are perhaps having some degree of like broad direction, but they are civil servants that are not they're dependent on parties. And if not, like I'm going to give credit to opening government. Like if the government is so powerful and like meddles in everything, then presumably also control universities and probably also own a bunch of corporations. The second reason we give about why it's going to be done fairly is because states want to be ensuring competitive markets. To which closing opposition says like, oh, but like those big companies are able to like lobby. But again, right, like any amount of small lobbying that you might be able to get probably doesn't outweigh the market incentives of like things like companies becoming more competitive, a company being able to set up in your jurisdiction. All of those are things that presumably politicians care about more. The final thing is just the collective lobby from all of those companies, right? Smaller companies have substantial power as a collective. Even the large companies want to ensure fairness, so all of them have access to it. So you probably have preemptive regulations like transparency requirements, like having fairness for who is getting to access it, so no one is able to capture it because collectively everyone has an incentive for fairness. Before I go on, I'll take opening.
Yeah, sorry. This vested interest of states lies in the election cycle because they're inherently short-termist, which necessarily means that they focus on outcome-dependent research. Doesn't that take out all of your arguments?
No, it doesn't, because lots of the things that we are talking about is also like outcome good, right? Like, I don't know why outcomes are bad. Like, if we are able to ensure that you get like beneficial research into things that otherwise big companies that are owning it are not doing it, and it leads to good outcomes, it's a great thing. I don't know. Like, if you didn't explain why like something long-term is like so necessarily better, I would also know that long-term results are obviously still considered by civil servants, also by like states who are in power for relatively long periods of time. Anyway. Why is then the status quo inefficient? Here I want to be clear about the weighing over opening government, right? Because large companies, university centers are charging others to use this. This is the opening government claim. They suggest that the harm is cost. We will suggest that the problem is not just that. The problem is that the corporations, and true, not everything is owned by corporations, but the most important ones are like AI, like pharmaceutical, biomedics, large machines that are being used in order to do research for those things. They are not using it to monopolize the market and actively exclude potential competition. Once again, OG says they charge them. We say you don't let them use it at all. That's obviously a far stronger claim. Vaji explains why the large companies have an incentive not to rent out that equipment because of competition. But secondly, when they are the ones who are owning it, they are not using it to, for example, extend their research, look into drugs or look into uses of AI that are not in the tunnel vision of what these companies are already doing. This creates far larger and more beneficial benefits than opening government, and I'm very proud to propose.
I would like to thank the speaker very much for the speech, and I'd like to invite the last speaker for the opposition.
Hello. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Delightful. For points of information, if you could just do the hand up react, I'll call on you when I get a second. Alrighty. For a debate about science and research, it's interesting that the only team that seems to save a life is closing opposition, because we just explained to you that research equipment is also used in treating patients. When you image a brain to do research about how synapses work, you also see if there's a blood clot that's about to kill someone. When you decide whether or not a new virus is interesting or worth of a vaccine, you can also see genetic failures in someone's DNA that will cripple them for life. We are the team that ensures that you can use this research equipment for multiple purposes, and thus we save lives. All of the research from the rest of this debate is speculative because it is high-end, interesting kinds of equipment. I do not think you can say with certainty that any of this research is mutually exclusive to either team. I do not think you can say with certainty that any of this research will definitely save a life, but we explain to you day after day, month after month, this kind of equipment being in hospitals ensures people can walk out those doors and live another day. So that's where I'm going to start, why closing opposition saves lives. What other responses we get to this material? We get two pretty half-hearted responses from closing government. First is they say that, well, some of these aren't research equipment. Well, it's like, yeah, we're not talking about those ones. The most important and the most functional ones are the ones that are getting taken away, which is, they're the most important ones because, they're the high-end research equipment. But second of all, they say that, well, when the state owns it, we don't actually have to take them out of hospitals. But first, this is a direct knife of what their opening said, because their opening said that there would be centralized research facilities as opposed to having them be in universities everywhere. So this argument doesn't stand by the laws of debating. But second of all, even if it did, we just explained to you that there would still be an approval process of some kind that would limit the speed with which someone could access those resources, because presumably other researchers are now in that hospital doing weird research stuff, which means that it's just way harder to get access to those kinds of tools. What the weighing on this is just what I explained in the introduction. With absolute certainty, we are the side that saves lives. In opening half and in every other part of this debate, there's a bunch of shenanigans about symmetry and whether or not sides actually have good incentives. We just tell you with certainty we save someone's life. There should be a very clear first on this argument alone. But luckily for us, we have two more arguments, which are also incredible. Because first, we explain to you that the output done by governments is done in incredibly bad ways. And the first and easiest way this argument wins the debate is just we identify that this means there is no international cooperation between firms, because some of the best research that is produced in the world is when the highest and the most prestigious universities across countries collaborate. But when governments are the ones who decide who can access this equipment, they never collaborate with other countries, because new and innovative research is seen as national security information. So new research on diseases that could potentially save lives and produce vaccines isn't done. New research on artificial intelligence that can reduce the cost of production in literally every sphere is now no longer done, because people view this as being national security and important. What this means is that all of the shit from opening half about whether or not this is efficient or whether or not this gets more research just doesn't matter, because we explained to you governments structurally stop collaboration. That means you get less research. We provide you the other mechanisms, which just explain you get less specialist access, and there's just a whole bunch of bureaucracy you've got to slog through. The weighing on that one is similarly easy. First, we explain to you that this does just mean less research occurs on the whole. And second of all, we explain to you it is the most important kinds of research that necessitates cross-government collaboration. Our third extension is just an explanation about the production of machines, because we just say that when there is only one buyer in a market, that buyer can short every other producer, and it means those producers don't want to make their stuff anymore, and this means you have less equipment. The only response to this is CG saying, well, all the other firms benefit from this equipment being produced, but that just isn't doing the debate, right? Because they're not subsidizing the government in any meaningful way that we can see. But yeah, and that just means that response doesn't really function. At the end of that, weighing that issue is that Opening Hof seems to be obsessed with the quality of research, but when we explain to you, now firms who aren't universities are less incentivized to make this kind of equipment. It doesn't matter how efficient and how good it is, it does just mean you get less production. At the end of that, we have three winning extensions. We certainly save people's lives. We definitely ensure the best and highest quality research continues to occur, and we ensure that the actual kinds of equipment that is necessary gets produced on our side. Before I start deleting all the other teams in this debate, I'll take a point from closing.
Yeah, so the reason this equipment is so expensive is because companies lock the tech away. We make it cheaper to cross-supply and replicate the proprietary, but even if we didn't, isn't it more just for the state to spread one MRI machine per 100 patients other than having 50 in Sydney and none elsewhere?
So on that first one, you've just like changed the debate, right? Because like this isn't the state is allowing people to use their MRI machines when they have pains in the head. It is just for research. That's what you've got to defend. And the second part about it being expensive is just like, you don't know, like factually untrue. It is expensive because these are delicate machines that you need to produce with huge quantities of precision, and you need experts maintaining them. You reducing patents doesn't actually fix that. So, you know, as a treat then, let's start with CG and explaining why their material doesn't work. Their main claim is that this reduces monopolies. We kind of pulled this instantly from Member when we explained to you that there is huge quantities of corporate capital, which means monopolies exist anyways. We have a few additional responses. First, that isn't how this debate works, right? Because this isn't a debate about abolishing patents. It's about nationalizing the resources you use to produce those patents. So even if the state had all of this equipment, you still have patents, and this means you still scalp people. So the first person to do the research is now the one who can set the prices very high. So all of the harms of closing government is symmetric. But second of all, even if it is, and they're proposing that they actually just strip patents away from all research, that is a whole series of harms as well. It is just that now no firm wants to invest in the production of medicine because they can't be sure they're going to get a return on their investment. It means no one is going to do the supply chain construction and the research and the production of these vaccines, which just means even if all of these patents are widely accessible, no one produces these patents because they don't want to have to refund all the experts they paid to do all of this research. But third of all, even if that is, and even if none of that stands, universities on our side can just make other machines because they seem to have this conception that there is only one machine for each kind of vaccine and like big pharma has it. But if this was the case, there'd be a huge incentive for a university to make that machine because they could undercut big pharma, and that means that there is incentives for there to be a lot of different machines. So clearly this monopoly point is quite silly. On opening our government then, we just simply explained to you that all of that stuff about cost and efficiency is just symmetric. Like universities and other firms have incentives to allocate their resources quickly because they want to ensure they remain profitable and they want to ensure they have some level of credit in this whole academia game. What this means is that government bench is either incredibly symmetric, incredibly speculative, or doesn't engage with the fact that like closing opposition saves lives. All of the analysis that I gave at the start of the speech about why our extensions were POG also weighs us up over our opening. Proud to close the opposition.
I would like to thank Speaker very much for a speech and everyone for this debate. Because I'm judging this with myself, I'll just mute myself. I'll come back here as soon as I have a call. So please don't leave the breakout room, etc. I think volunteer, you can stop recording.